Welcome to today's webinar, Expanding Your Global Research Footprint, a Publisher's Perspective. Thank you for participating. This webinar is organized by Thailand National Science and Technology Development Agency, NSTDA. I am Professor Dr. Supapan Seraphin, Senior Advisor. Professional Authorship Center, PAC, NSTDA. I will be the moderator of this webinar, supported by Simon Grimley, also another advisor here at NSTDA. We are very fortunate to have the foreign speakers for today's event. We have Mr. Barry Clarke, Managing Director, Taylor Francis Asia Pacific, Dr. Rick Lee, General Manager, World Scientific Publishing.
Put Rick Lee's picture up.
And Dr. Ed Gerstner, Director of Journal Policy and Strategy, Springer Nature. We're going to have each speaker present their slides about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have about an hour of your questions and answers. So please write down your question, and then we will select your answer, your question, and then we will answer those. For this webinar today, we have over 370 participants registered, and we are very pleased and honored for all the speakers who are going to share their knowledge with us. There are notes that we put down in one of the slides that this webinar will be recorded in case more people interested in. And then all presentation files and recording of the webinar will be shared with everyone for this event. After presentation, we will have, as I said, an hour discussion. So please type your question in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will address all your questions as much as we can. And last but not least, very important for this kind of event, could you please fill in feedback form or questionnaire for the event. So I think we are ready to start, and we will have Barry Clarke from Taylor Francis Asia Pacific. Please, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Supapan, and thank you, Simon, and the whole team at NSTDA. We appreciate it. So let me start sharing my screen. And let's see if it comes up. Okay. Can you confirm that's okay?
So there we are, Barry. That looks good.
Okay. I've just got a problem on my end. I've lost my notes, so let me just stop sharing and I'll try again. Forgive me. Okay, I've just got a problem with my notes. I'm just not. So let me just try again. Okay, how's that? Is that good?
No, we're still seeing your notes.
Okay. Let's try.
You need display. I think that's it. That's it. That's the one.
Okay. All right. For some reason, I've lost the notes my end, so that's a little bit frustrating. I don't know why. Okay, well, let me begin anyway. So thank you very much again for this opportunity. I'm from Taylor & Francis. I'm Managing Director for the Taylor & Francis business Asia Pacific, and I'm going to be talking first about the first steps, finding the right journal. Publishing a journal is a journey, and I am going to just see if I can find my notes because I will need them. Okay. Is that good?
No, we're still seeing your notes.
Okay. When I lose the notes on your screen, I'm picking up nothing at all. Is that okay?
That's good, Ed. I'm sorry, Barry.
Okay, thank you. I do apologize for that. I was got two screens I'm working from. So again, let me say thank you very much for this opportunity. And as I was saying, I want to take you on a journey. Publishing is a journey, and I want to first give you advice about how to increase the chances of your article arriving at your desired destination. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the publishing cycle and how to choose a journal before handing over to my colleagues. But first, where did our journey at Taylor & Francis, in fact, in academic publishing, begin? So I'd like to start with a little bit of history and take you right back to 1665, when the very first journal was published. Out of London, the Royal Society published the Philosophical Transactions. The president was Henry Oldenberg. And so what we say in academic publishing is that we follow the Oldenberg Principles. There's 4 principles of publishing. One is that you register the ownership of your research to a particular author, that research is evaluated and certified through a quality control peer review process. And then we disseminate your claims, your research through the peer review, through the journal network. And very importantly, the 4th principle that we still follow today is that there is a permanent record of your work through an archiving process. Obviously, the technology has changed a great deal since 1665, but those principles are still the same today. In fact, that is an image of the very first journal ever published, the Philosophical Transactions. The publishing landscape today is very different. There are something like 10,000 publishers, 5,000 of which are indexed on Scopus. That's an incredible number of publishers, but that means there are over 33,000 English language peer-reviewed journals published around the world. Over 3 million articles per year are published in those journals. And these numbers are increasing by 3 to 4% every single year. And of course, what's driving this is the amazing investment in research and development across the world, but particularly in Asia Pacific in recent years. It is estimated that there are something like 7 to 8 million researchers around the world trying to tell their stories. So you're in very good company. Taylor & Francis, where do we fit into this ecosystem? Just a couple of moments on our history. We were founded in 1798 with the publication of a new journal called Philosophical Magazine. We have a very well-known and respected imprint in social sciences and humanities called Routledge, which was founded in the 1830s. acquired by Taylor and Francis about 20 odd years ago. And we also have an imprint in the sciences, technology, engineering and medicine, CRC Press, for which the most famous handbook of physics and chemistry is now into its 101st edition. We've kept up with the times. We are an open access publisher. We have an imprint called Cogent. And this year, we've acquired an organization called F1000 Research, which provides open access, open research platforms to institutions and to funding bodies. So that's how we fit into the ecosystem of academic publishing. But what you're interested in is the journey that you want to take your article on. So I say it is a journey, but you need to be clear about that publishing process so that all the tips that I and my colleagues give you later fit in to this journey. So I'd like to point out that there are different versions of the article. It's important to understand the significance of each version. The first version is your author's original or preprint. This is the version of your article that you submit for review. And you can post this anywhere at any time. That is your content, that is your research. An accepted manuscript after a peer review process or postprint, there are some restrictions on what you can do with this. But because it hasn't been copyrighted or typeset, only accepted, you can still post this version on your own personal website or share on social media. If the article is to be published in a subscription-based journal, there may be an embargo period before you can put your article on a repository. But if the journal is an open access journal, then yes, you can post this version, the AM version, the accepted manuscript version, immediately. And then finally, once your article is published, there is the version of record. This is the final published version of your article, and this is maintained by the publisher and updated with relevant information, and this cannot be posted online. This is where the publisher comes in more strongly, if you like. But how do you choose the journal? Choosing the right journal is very important. You need to know the audience that you're hoping to reach. Is your audience your own university colleagues? Maybe are they local or are they truly international? What level is your research aimed at? Is it researchers or is it practitioners or possibly the general public? Are you sure your article is not a magazine article or actually a chapter of a book? Or maybe it's your PhD thesis. And is it research in progress? Is it a literature review? Again, you must be clear about what you're doing. The answers to these questions will help guide your choices. So let me ask you a question. I can't see a show of hands, but do you think you should write your article for a specific journal, or do you think you should write your article first and then find a journal that's most suitable? Well, if there was a show of hands, and all the times I've done this presentation, normally most people choose B. But actually, you should be in the minority, and you should actually write your article for a specific journal. That is a very important point. So again, you need to think about the audience and then find the right journal for your article. And the best way to start to do that is to read the aims and scope of the journal. Editorial boards of journals literally spend weeks crafting their aims and scope statements on websites. Their goal is clearly explained, so you should be able to work out exactly what they're trying to achieve with the journal. The aims and scope statements will include key information about peer review policy, for example. Editors often have to reject papers without sending them out to review because they are simply inappropriate for that journal. So save yourself and the editorial board's time and energy by carefully reading the aims and scope statement before submitting your article for consideration. If you're unsure, you can send an abstract of your paper to the journal to see if they might be interested. Not all editors will answer this type of query, but it may be worth a try. So now I've got another tip. You are joining a conversation with other contributors to that journal. So again, you must research the journals in your field. And here are some tips on how to do that. Please visit your university library. Not all territories, of course, that's possible at the moment, but where it is, please do make use of your library. Do look at publisher websites, journal websites. Talk to your peers. Find out what they're reading, where they're thinking of publishing. Especially talk to people that you admire in your faculty. And talk to people who have previously published with that journal. But most importantly, do read the aims and the scope of the journal. I've got a third tip now. Ask the right questions and know the right answers. Who or what is the journal's editor, the editorial board? Who is the publisher? Make sure it's a reputable publisher, and I'll come to that in a moment. Who are the authors contributing to the journal? Is there a society affiliation? Try to build up a picture of the readership. And then there are other factors that you can look at. The impact factor of the journal, that may be important to you or the people around you or your funding body. Peer review. Some journals are not peer reviewed, the better ones are. So make sure that that is a question that you've asked yourself. What is the submission process? What is the open access policy? Open access is a changing ecosystem, and Ed will give more details about this later, but do check what the open access policy is on the journal website. As I mentioned, choosing the right publisher is very important, and you have to be very careful at the moment, especially with the rise of open access. We are seeing the emergence of what we call predatory publishers. I can imagine some of you have even been contacted by these publishers who show an interest in your work and ask you to submit to their journal. They might claim the peer review process is unrealistically short. The websites might feature information that actually, when you look into it, is incorrect or misleading, such as perhaps claiming to have a global impact factor. There is no such thing. So there are some characteristics of predatory journals that are hidden, and you need to be very, very careful. And some of the fees are not transparent. The lack of quality peer review of articles by experts in the field is by far the main concern we have about predatory publishing. If you want to research, if you want your research to be read and respected by others in your field, locally or internationally, it is very important that you avoid these fake journals. They erode the credibility of all research published. So you need to make informed choices. And the publishing community globally got together a few years ago to come up with a new campaign to help you think, check, and then submit your article. Please do follow these guidelines. Be very careful where you publish. And there are resources that are available to help you decide whether a journal is legitimate or not. There's this directory of open access journals. And there's also an organization that is a membership of all the reputable publishers. So you can check these websites for the journal and for the publisher to make sure that you are publishing with a legitimate journal, to make sure that your story continues its journey. So here's a few checklists before you submit your article. Make sure your title page has all the names of the authors and co-authors. Make sure the abstract keywords and main text is there. Make sure your figures, image, and table files are all there. Supplementary material, biographical notes, and very importantly, a cover letter. Do have a critical friend to review the article one last time and send in the correct version. Now that may sound a little bit ridiculous. Who would send in the incorrect version of the article? But actually, with all the changes that you might make, it is actually quite common for the wrong version of a journal to be submitted. So do please pay attention to sending the correct version of your paper. There we go. As if to labor the point, make sure you send the correct version of the article. So that's coming to an end of my part of the presentation. I'll just leave you with a top 10 reasons for rejection. I won't go through these in detail. I don't think I've got quite time, but this will be available for viewing later, and we can circulate the slides. These are the main reasons that articles get rejected. And I think now I can hand over to Rick, who's going to give you some more tips on how to get published.
Thank you, Barry. Very informative, and certainly get us started on the right track, and we will have further discussion after we all finish with presentations. So Dr. Rick Lee, General
Hello.
Manager of World Scientific Publishing. While you are setting up, I would like to inform everyone that Barry and Dr. Lee are based in Singapore. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Actually, I'm very happy to talk about some of this experience that I think is very useful for especially those new researchers who start the publishing journey. That's what Barry mentioned about. It is a journey. One of the reasons I find it very interesting is because actually I've gone through this journey, but I was fortunate enough because when I start my PhD program at that time, I've been in my year, there are only 2 students, me and another person from MIT. So we are the center of attention from the whole department. So a lot of so-called mistakes that I can see nowadays, a lot of young researchers have gone through. We never make that kind of mistake. We were very lucky. But I think it's very important to share. Now I'm on the other side of the publishing process. I'll be in the publishing role rather than the author. I think it's good for me to actually share this experience. Although I said it's a basic do's and don'ts, but we still see a lot of people making that kind of mistakes. Okay. As compared to the other 2 colleagues here, I represent from World Scientific Publishing. We are very young. We don't have hundreds of years of history. I just write down a few things about our company. We were established in Singapore in 1981. We now have over 450 staff globally in 13 offices. Every year, we publish around 600 new titles in the STM, mainly in the STEM STEM, and over 140 journals a year. And most of these journals are already in the Web of Science. And one of the projects that we are very proud of is because we have an exclusive agreement with Nobel Foundation to publish the entire series of Nobel lectures in all subjects from 1901 onward. Because our relationship with Nobel Foundation, we do have a lot of experience, learn from the Nobel laureates, and then from the foundation. Okay, let me go to the main point of today's talk, the do's. Let me start with the do's. One of the first thing now, because now everything is on the internet, and the identity on the internet sometimes can be very easily be mistaken by some other people, especially people can use this false identity to represent someone else. That's why the first thing you need to do is to establish your identity on the internet, in the publishing world. Of course, the first one you should have is the OCID, which is like an identity number on the internet. With OCID, you can put down all the publications that are actually published by you. And I thought that this is quite a simple thing, but lately we actually come into one scenario I can share with you is we received one article, and that article, because the author, the name is very long, is from India, and there was possibly a typo, and we can't be sure that it's really the right person. So at the end, what we have to do is actually from the OCID, we find out that is exactly the right person, but because of the typo of his name and also at the same time on his email address. Now, if without that, actually one of the things we might do, we probably would just reject the paper because we are not so sure this is really the person impersonating someone else. So this is important. It's very easy to apply. Okay, all these are free. And the next one that you have now is plug-ons. Now, plug-ons is actually more for people to keep track of the articles, the citations, and if one day you become a reviewer, your reviewing history will be recorded. Now, that is how you establish your professional profile in this professional scenes. So I urge you, if you don't have yet, better apply OCID and at the same time register in plug-ons. Now, just now Barry also mentioned about the how to pick the right journals. Yeah, he also talk about the think, check, and submit. Actually, this is a very simple to follow. They have a whole checklist for you to look it up, how to identify a legitimate publisher and journals, and what are the things that you should watch out. So it is one of the first things you should take a look. As what he mentioned about the Manuscript is very, very true. A lot of times we reject article because we just use the word out of scope. Because when the person submit the article, they didn't pay attention enough on the Manuscript, and they submit to the wrong journal. Now, sometimes there is another way to look at where you can publish your articles. One of the things that I've been telling people is you look at the paper that you reference. Where are they come from? Where are the contributors? Which journal they published? And see whether it's relevant to yours. And a lot of time, those journals may be suitable for you. Another thing that you may need to pay attention is actually related to the acceptance rate or the rejection rate I mentioned. And if you are looking for open access, one of the things is you have to look at the impact factor. In general, if the impact factor is higher, the rejection rate is also higher. If it's open access, in general, the article processing charge is higher, the rejection rate is also higher. And also, if a journal that is a hybrid in that sense, normally, if they have the same impact factor as an adult journal who is open access, the hybrid one will be the rejection rate is slightly higher. So these are some of the tips that you can think about to when you submit a journal, submit an article to a journal. Another thing is submit according to specifications. Now, this time, in my time when I do my research, it will never happen. The reason is because we didn't submit journal through the internet. At that time, we still use mail. You just think about if I make some silly mistakes, and then when I send over and then they come back, and then I make some mistakes in order to on the styles, on the image, or all these things. So it will be very time consuming. But now, because of the internet, you submit to the platform. Normally there is a submission platform that you can submit your article, and people make a lot of careless mistakes. Now, that actually is a very serious issue. We have a lot of cases because the rejection is because of they are not submitting to our specification. And there is another point that you need to take note is on the turnaround. For all those high rejection rate journals, you need to pay attention. Sometimes the rejection rate is not advertised, but how do you know the rejection rate is high? Sometimes you look at the other already published article and look at the submission date and publish date. Then you see whether there is a very fast turnaround. And you can also look up how fast ahead they publish. And that you can get some hints. This journal may have a higher rejection rate. Okay. So these 2 points are very important when you are doing the submission. The next one is more on the content, how you prepare your content. Okay. When you started publishing, one of the things that you know, you are nobody. No, people don't know about you. It's a new name. You just imagine a journal editor look at someone submit an article. This is a new person, never published before. Do you think that journal publisher will take highly of your article? Will be willing to spend a lot of time to go through the peer review? I mean, in reality, this is not that likely to happen. That's the reason at the beginning, if possible, you try to find a collaborator, a well-known collaborator or someone already have published before, so that your name is already in the system. That means when it's in Web of Science or in other databases, your name is there, and you are not a nobody. So that's why at the very beginning, you try to work with some senior collaborators to publish. And actually, that is one of the things that maybe helps me. I have never been rejected my publication because my very first few papers, actually, I worked with my advisor and also the faculty, senior faculty in the department. That's how I get started. And I think that is a very important point for those young researchers when they get started. The next thing is especially true for those non-native English-speaking authors. I still remember my time when after I finished my paper, I have asked so many of my colleagues and my advisor, my classmates to go through my paper to pick out some of the mistakes in terms of the languages. I still remember the main word they always use, the one word, they said wordy, because I explain things in a long English phrases. That is wordy. So that is actually very helpful for me, because at that time there isn't any other resources out there for us to do this kind of thing. But nowadays there are more and more resources out here. For example, we publish a book that is mainly for non-native English speaking author called Science Research Writing. Now that I'm sure there are many other similar publications out there to help you. I mean, if possible, of course, you can find someone who are native English speaking to go through your article to make sure that all the way you present is easily understandable. In addition to that, actually nowadays there are a lot of other services online that actually can provide you a lot of help. But these are commercial services. We have no connection with them, but we know them. One is Editage, the other one is NSTDA. So they provide actually service including how to publish how to polish your language, how to even advise you on which journal that your paper can go to. But of course, these are all paid services. But I mean, if it's necessary, you can even consider that. So these are some of the most important points that you need to pay attention, especially on the language side. We do receive a lot nowadays. We find that in our case, we have a lot of publication actually coming out from China or other parts of Asia. And over the years, I see that the language proficiency improved. But I still remember years ago when we first started, when I first joined the company to do as an editor, I really find that the language just by itself actually is one, it doesn't worth us the time to even go through the article. So it may have a lot of good science in it, but it's the presentation on the language actually, we have no choice, has to reject the papers. So that's why this part is very important. Another point that I would like to highlight is on the when you write an article, make sure you do your literature survey properly. Especially, you need to reference some of those latest research results. Otherwise, I mean, your conclusion or your science or whatever, your content inside may be outdated, and that is sometimes when you pass through the reviewer may ask you to your result. Have you ever read some other articles that are more recent that may have a different perspective to your study? And of course, when you do the paper, you need to pay special attention to the abstract and conclusion, because that is actually one of the first things an editor will look at before they look at the full content. So that those two parts, you have to be pay extra attention to how to put it properly, put it in a easy to understand way, so that it's actually can draw your attention to the readers. And of course, when doing a scientific publishing, and then you have to have a proper logic and structure of your article. I mean, we have seen some new researcher, sometimes their logic and structure are a little bit of convoluted, and it is not easy to follow. And that is also one of the points that people will reject your article. One of the things that people need to pay attention, the whole peer review process. The peer review process actually is not just to get rid of those articles that are no good, but sometimes actually in a way it's also help the researcher to do a better job to present the output. And that's why you should pay extra attention how to improve based on the peer review feedback. Just now, Barry also mentioned about the different versions of a publication, the version of work record, which one you can share, which one you cannot. You are not supposed to. There is a place that you can go to and take a look, is how you can share your articles. Is how can I share it? Actually, is the word how can I share it.com. I think one of the things nowadays is, once you publish an article, you want as many people to read it, and one day they cite your articles. So that's why sharing it is important. But to share in a proper way is also very important. You don't want your article being shared in a place that you didn't intend to. So that's the reason you need to pay extra attention to that. Now, the last point here actually is very interesting. I never thought about that. I get this point from my colleague. She is actually in the audience today because she takes care of two of our most important journals. And I never thought about that. What she mentioned to me is, sometimes when we reject an article, it's not necessarily because of the quality is no good. It's because it goes to the wrong place. That means out of scope, what just now we mentioned. But I think a lot of people are shy, or dare not to ask. They only ask why you reject, but they never ask in a proper way, is to ask for recommendation. So if you think my article is rejected, they should ask, is there any other recommendation, other journal that I should submit to the journal, to the article to? And I think this is also one of the things that we need to learn nowadays, because there are many more journals than it used to be. Barry mentioned about 10,000 journals. So there are a lot of times, actually, we also know what our editors also know what other journals are doing. So they have a very clear understanding. Some of the journal is also by the same publishing house like us. We publish similar journal, but different on the different topics, but they are close enough. But we also understand our competitors or other journals in the field. So actually, these editors actually have a lot of knowledge about where the articles should go to. So if you can communicate well with this editor, they are more than happy to help you, to direct you, to give you comments where you should submit your journals. So this is one of the points that actually I never thought about until the day when I talked to my colleagues. She mentioned to me, and I found that this is a very important and useful tips for all the new researchers when they start publishing, and then if their articles are being rejected, what to do. Okay, the next thing actually is my last slide. Because once you do the right things, unlikely you will get into trouble. Unlikely you will get your article rejected. But there are a lot of other points that I find that these days is still happening, and it shouldn't be. And I think because nowadays we hear that the phrase is publish or perish. I mean, publish become it's become a something that actually for all the researchers, in order to survive, you have to publish, and that kind of pressure create a lot of issues. I mean, the first thing that we hear is plagiarism, okay? And plagiarism is a very serious matter, and we take it very seriously. I think that is the whole point of all the publishing houses take it very seriously, and it's a very bad thing for anyone being coined who have plagiarized someone's work. So that's why don't fall into that. Because you are not doing plagiarism, you are not trying to copy other people, but because you don't know some of the tips or some of the rules, you get into that kind of issues or problems. Okay, one of the things that, for example, I can share with you how publisher identify this plagiarism is actually through this authenticated. It's basically a service. It helps to compare your submitted article with all the pools of millions and millions of articles and see any similarities. So this is one way we try to identify any plagiarism. Now, a lot of times, actually, people are not intended to do plagiarism, but they don't know some of the rules because it's also go back to the master of the language. Sometimes they don't know that actually they shouldn't just cut and paste previous people's study because they need to refer to it. When they do cut and paste, when the system do the plagiarism analysis, they will identify this actually a copy from someone else. So that's why it's very important you should rewrite and don't simply copy and paste. That even consider your own publication. You shouldn't do that. In fact, if you really want to, they are actually in the authenticated website. They even give you, you want to do you want to quote your previous study or someone else's previous study, you should put in quote. But how to put in a quote also can make a difference. A single quote doesn't count as a quote. So you thought that actually you are quoting someone, actually is not true. So you should go and study how authenticated, how to do the comparison, and make sure you don't fall into that issue yourself. The next point I want to highlight is, I can't imagine that happen, but it's happening, is there are young researchers who submit to multiple journals at the same time. This is something I thought that is obvious, but at the end, recently we still have a lot of cases in our publishing house. We have seen similar cases, but how we find out actually? It just happened to be we have a few journals handled by the same in-house editors. So they will suddenly they find out that this person submit multiple the same article to multiple journals. That is unethical in that sense. Okay, if you are being spotted to do this, actually you probably one of these days you are in our bad list, because we find you because you submit to our journals. But I mean, what if your articles also submit to another journal at the same time? We won't know about it. So in the future, if I see this author, probably I won't be interested to look into it. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to get into that kind of problem yourself. So never submit the same article at the same time to multiple journals. Okay, this is wrong. The next one is that don't resubmit right away after rejection due to quality issues. Okay, this one actually is a feedback from one of our managing editors, and they find that actually nowadays, because people getting a high pressure to publish, some of them is actually graduate student, PhD student, they want to graduate, they need to have the paper published. But they get rejected because of some quality issue. They just, because of the timing, all these issues, all these reasons, they make minor correction and try again. Actually, I tell you, when we receive something like this, actually we don't want to spend our time at all. We will reject right away. So you're wasting your own time and also other people's time. So make sure when you, because of quality issue, make sure you do a proper job, a serious revision before you resubmit again. Okay, that part is most important. Lastly, this part I think is also quite different from the time when I was doing my research, doing publishing. Because at my time, I think we don't need to publish so many papers. But nowadays, because usually you can see people publish a couple hundred papers, I just really don't understand. I mean, do they need to do research? They don't. How can they have so much time to write papers and get it published? Actually, nowadays, people publish a lot more papers than it used to be. In fact, as I mentioned, we have a close relationship with Nobel Foundation. We have a lot of Nobel laureates as our author, and I met up with quite a number of all these the Nobel Prize Committee chair, and we talk about research. And then they also have that impression nowadays people publish paper just because of the small little result, then they get one new paper. So that means the quality of paper actually individually is very minor. So that's why I think that this is not something that we would like the industry to go into that direction, becoming like a factory just generate papers, but with very little result. So I urge everyone, when you do publish your paper, make sure you do it in the result has to be substantial enough. Don't just a small little result and you publish a paper, and eventually your paper won't get cited that high, and you can see that you have a lot of paper, but your H index is not going up. So that's why I think that it's very important. People will do a good proper job. Your main point is do research, and your publication is to tell people what you have done, not a little bit progress, you put it up a paper. They're just to have the paper count. Okay, I think I just stop here. I hope that these small little tips to help you to have a better success in your next submission to a journal to publish your paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's really very practical do and don't.
Thank
So
you.
the next talk will be by Dr. Ed Gerstner from London, Springer Nature, and he's going to tell us about making your research count. Please, Ed.
Ed, can you just hold on for a minute? We can't hear you. Ed, could you please try to mute and then unmute your mic?
Unpack.
Or maybe unplug your headset. Speak through your computer, through your laptop.
Does he hear you? How do we know that he will hear you?
Any suggestions?
Do we have any way?
Sorry, Ed, maybe if you, technical staff here says to log out and log back in. And in the meanwhile, we will address a couple of the questions that have come up. Would that be all right? Thumbs up? All right, good stuff. Okay, while we wait for Ed to come back online, a couple of questions have come up. The first question we've got here, how does one know the rejection rate of a particular journal? And is there a database? Barry, since you're up there, would you maybe attempt to answer that question? Is there any way of finding out the rejection rate of particular journals?
I actually don't know. Rejection rates are not usually commonly publicized, to my knowledge, but people do get to hear about it. Rick, you raised a particular issue in your presentation, and you mentioned impact factor and rejection rates being often correlated.
Yes, actually, some journals do publish rejection rate. For example, I see that like Nature Communication on the website, they put an acceptance rate of 30%. That means rejection rate is 70%. And another one like +1, around 50%. Now, some journals do publicize some of the rejection rate, but majority they don't. As what Barry said, majority they don't tell you what is the rejection rate. But at some point you can guess by looking at the turnaround time of some of the journal. If the journal turnaround time is fast, normally that means the rejection rate is also very high.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, thank you.
And Barry?
Yeah, can I just add, sometimes
Sure.
this measures rejection rate or impact factor. In some cases, it may be a bit misleading.
Right.
It could be that you get a new journal that's actually meeting the needs of a particular focused group, and actually, they're accepting quite a lot, and there's not accepting everything. It's because it's such a new area, and there's a lot of buzz of activity. So I think one has to be careful when looking at both impact factors and rejection rates. And I think internally, I might be right in saying that that's one of the reasons we don't publicize rejection rates, because we're worried about giving the wrong impression.
Yep, agree. Okay,
Thank you both. Let's get back to Ed. Are you there
Excellent.
yet?
Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Excellent.
Yes.
Great.
Very good. Did you catch anything of what I said in the beginning?
No, not at
No,
all.
no.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I'll start again.
Back to square one.
Thank you everyone for listening. I'm very glad to be here. I wish I could be there in person. I'm a big fan of Southeast Asia. I spent 6 years in Shanghai. I moved back to London 2 years ago, but the previous 6 years to that, I was in Shanghai. I did a lot of travel in Asia, Southeast Asia. Thailand is one of my favorite places in the world. I miss it dearly. It's been a while since I've been there. I wish I could be there with you in person, but I'm glad to be there virtually. My name's Ed Gerstner. I'm the Director of Journal Policy and Strategy for Springer Nature. I joined Nature 18 years ago. I've been an editor on Nature Materials, Nature Physics, Nature Communications, and I've been around the world talking about these sorts of issues, about how people can get their papers published and how they can improve the impact of their papers. So let me talk a bit about Springer Nature. Springer Nature was formed from the merger of Nature Publishing Group, Palgrave Macmillan, Macmillan Education, and Springer Science, Business and Media in 2015, which had brought together many of the most significant publishing brands in science and scholarship. So Nature Research, you're probably aware of. We publish Nature and many sister journals, Nature Genetics, Nature Cell Biology, Scientific Reports, Scientific Data, and many other. Springer publishes both books and journals. They're a very well-esteemed journal publisher, and they publish across all the world's leading open access publishers. It's pioneered open access publishing since 2000. And again, it too publishes across many of the disciplines. One thing I wanted to echo, which both Barry and Rick have said, is the importance of choosing a journal and avoiding predatory publishers. I can't emphasize that enough. Open access has encouraged a lot of shady organizations to try and trick people into publishing with them with promises of easy publication and taking their money and then just putting it on a website. The thing I would say, two things I would say. When you're looking for a journal to publish in, look where your colleagues are publishing. Look where people that you respect in your field are publishing. You will want your research to be appearing beside the people in your community, because if your papers are being published in the journals where other people in your community are publishing, these are also the journals that they're reading. And what you want to be isn't just published, you want to be read. You want your research to make an impact. So spend time working out what are the journals that you like reading and what are the journals that your colleagues in your research community are publishing in, and that will help guide your decision as to where to publish. So I'm going to talk about the importance of openness in science. So why should you care about open? Well, why do we care about open is because we see open access, open research, open science to be the future of science. In 2000s, there were only a handful of publishers: Biomed Central, BMC, PLOS, Optics Express, New Journal of Physics. But now most publishers, I will argue probably all publishers, are now publishing journals, in some cases all their journals, open access. So it's very much a force of publishing at the moment, and we see it as the future. More and more, the time that we live in now really highlights the importance of science and scholarship to the world. Never before has research been so important to the world. And that science, to open up science to the world, to ensure that the results of science can be spread and used far and wide. It was about unlocking the power of science. Why should you care about being open? I'm going to talk again about this a little later on, because it actually improves the impact of your research. If there are no restrictions on being able to share your research and other people being able to read your research, it makes sense that it would make more impact because it reaches more people. And studies that we've done, in this particular case in journal Nature Communications, until I think it was 2016, 2015, Nature Communications published both subscription-based articles and open access articles, which gave us the opportunity to look at the impact of different article types, whether it was published under subscription or open access. And we found that open access articles were viewed 3 times as often as those articles which were published under subscription, and cited more often as well. Not as much as 3 times, but still there is lots of evidence to suggest that open access papers get cited more often, which means that your research is making more of an impact. But we also believe that more openness is important, because we see it's part of a solution to a critical problem facing science, which is the problem of reproducibility. A lot of what is published can't be reproduced, and that's a real problem, because that calls into question the robustness of the research of what's been published. And it's been come to know as the reproducibility crisis. And we've polled people about this in the past. We've asked researchers their opinions on this so-called crisis. And over half said they actually believe that there was a problem in science about the reproducibility of research that is published. 70% of the people that we polled found that they had, at one time or another, when they'd tried to reproduce the experiments of others that they'd read, they'd not been able to. But what's really astonishing is that half of the people that we asked admitted that when they tried to reproduce their own experiments, they were unable to reproduce them. So their own papers at one time or another, I'm not saying that 50% of their papers they couldn't reproduce. I'm saying that 50% of the people that we asked at one time or another had found that papers they published, they had been unable to reproduce the results. And there are lots of reasons for this. Being rushed to publication, as Rick said, publishing results that are not big studies, but getting a few more results and then rushing to publication without building up statistics, and many others. But one of the things, and I'm not talking about fraud, if people are saying that they are unable to reproduce their own results, obviously they didn't make up those results. And so the situation here isn't about people pretending that they've done experiments or trying to deliberately mislead. The problem here, as we can see, is that the problems are arising from lack of transparency and lack of openness in terms of the science, poorly described results, lack of transparency in terms of describing the experiments, overstated results, cherry picking. So only publishing a few results from many results is one way that you can get a misleading picture on what's happening in your experiments, or just sloppiness. And when we're talking about reproducibility, some of the greatest concerns are in journals that are subscription based. So this is not about an open access problem. This is a problem that all journals suffer. And the problem isn't about too much open, but too little. So some years ago, we published an analysis of microarray gene expression papers. These were papers that were published in Nature Genetics. It was an analysis of papers published in Nature Genetics, which is one of the world's leading genetics journals. So the research there you would expect to be of the highest caliber. And this study tried to reproduce the results that were presented in these many Nature Genetics papers, 10 in total. Sorry, no, that was 18 in total. They found that only 2 of those 18 could they reproduce the results fully. 6 of those 18 they could reproduce partially, but the majority, 10 of those 18 papers that they had tried to reproduce, they were unable to reproduce. And what they found, what they observed was that the papers that were most open about their research, giving detailed descriptions of the methodology, of the protocols, and those papers that actually published the data themselves, that gave the data away to researchers, were the ones that could be reproduced. And those that were less open were the ones that didn't provide all the data, that weren't as transparent and open about how the results were collected and conducted, were the ones that couldn't be reproduced. And so to try and improve the situation, for many years at Nature, we've introduced what we call reproducibility checklists. And these are lists that we ask authors to fill out to describe how their research was conducted in very specific ways. How many samples were used, what reasons they had for excluding the data, etc. This is mostly in the life sciences. And we are now publishing these reproducibility checklists alongside the papers themselves, so that our readers can see what the authors have done to improve the reproducibility of their research. But what about the results themselves? It's important to share papers widely, but what about data? The data themselves are arguably just as important as papers, arguably more important. And that's indeed what we feel that science should be about, because publishing research without data is basically advertising. It's not really science. Science exists in the results themselves, and other researchers need to be able to scrutinize those results and use those results in order to reproduce those results. And the benefits of sharing data, not just open papers, but open data, are manifold. They benefit researchers through greater recognition, more citations. They benefit research communities because the research becomes more useful, and they benefit society because if the research becomes useful, it makes more impact, and it leads to more and better impacts, benefits to the world. And probably the most salient example of this is the Human Genome Project. So, and this benefits the economy. The US government invested $14.5 billion in the Human Genome Project, and it ran it as an open research project. The data was open to everyone, and so they gave away, they didn't try and monetize or capitalize on the data that on their investment. And there are analyses of the impact of the Human Genome Project that suggest that the economic benefit in terms of economic stimulus, in terms of the creation of new fields of research, the creation of new technologies, was of the order of $1 trillion. That's a 178-to-1 return on investment, because the project was done in the open, because the results were opened up. Also, there are studies to show that open research is more productive research. Analysis of 7,000 NSF and NIH funded research projects found that those researchers who conducted their research with a view to opening up the data and providing data openly turned out to be twice as productive. They produced more papers, twice as many papers on average. This is from the original labs themselves, as those studies that didn't share their data. And I think one of the reasons for this is that if you're going to share data, you pay more attention to the quality of the data, to the description of the data, to the usefulness of the data, because there's no point in giving data away unless other people can use it. And because you pay more attention to the data itself, because you take more care with the data, particularly with how you describe it, it actually becomes more useful to you when you put yourself into this more open science, open research mode. You become more productive because the data, which is at the heart of everything that we do, becomes more precious to you. And so this is another of the benefits to thinking in a more open way about your research. And as I mentioned before, in many other fields, not just in Nature Communications, but in many fields, it's been shown that papers that are published alongside their data, so you go to read a paper and it will send you to a link where you can download that data, they get cited more often because papers that are published along with their data are more useful. And if it's more useful, it makes more impact. It has more impact in the world. And if it has more impact, then people will cite it more often. And our policy is that if you publish in a Nature journal, and in fact, or BMC journal and beyond, if you publish in a Nature journal, you are required to make data, materials, code, and other things available to anyone that asks for them. And we would encourage our authors also to put the data on an open data repository. Next slide. There we go. And at Nature and at BMC and increasingly at the Springer journals, we are requiring authors to tell readers how they can get hold of their data. So we are requiring our authors to publish what are called as data availability statements. And it could be as simple as, if you want access to the data, you should email the corresponding author. But ideally, we would like you to put in a statement that says, if you want access to the data, you can find it at this data repository over here. But what we found when we've talked to our researchers, our authors, is that the biggest hurdle to sharing isn't their desire to share it, but they don't know how. They don't know how to present it in a way. They don't know where they should share it. And so we've created a research help desk that provides advice and support for where people can deposit their data to share it, again, to improve the impact of their research. And some years ago, we launched a new kind of journal, which is called a data descriptor journal, which seeks to publish descriptions of large data sets, not gigantic, I'm not talking about big data, but important data sets, so that people can get credit for sharing their data, so that others can find that data, and so that others can use that data through an adequate description of what those data represent. And here's an example of the sort of structure of a data descriptor. A data descriptor is a sort of paper that simply describes a data set, how it was produced, what it's describing. It's not intended to replace conventional papers, which are designed to propose or test a scientific hypothesis. So that's my talk on data. I'm really keen to hear your questions. This is the most important part of today's presentation, is to hear your questions. So please don't be shy. In addition to talking a lot about open research and data, many places in the world I've gone to give talks very similar to the other people on the panel, Rick and Barry. So I have lots of experience answering questions more generally in terms of publishing and getting your papers published as well. So I really look forward to your questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ed. So I will hand it to Simon to get
Started with the questions.
started with the questions and yes.
Well, thank you, Ed, thank you, Barry, and thank you, Rick, for your excellent presentations. I know these are very big topics, and we don't have a lot of time, so we're just trying to highlight some of the key issues, and then maybe in the future we can do some more in-depth webinars. Now, a question that's come up here from one of our participants. Basically, they want to know that if they've submitted an article to a journal and the article is with the editor for more than a month, is that unusual? Barry, maybe to you?
It's not unusual. It is true that we're all trying to improve the speed of response, but I think if you get a response in a month, certainly if it's a detailed response with a decision, that's a good result, I think. Have the other two got any comments on that? I think a month would be a very good benchmark. Some journals can within a few days, but I'd say the average is more than a month.
It depends on what the response is. So at our journals, we try and make sure that the authors are made aware when a paper is sent out to review.
Yes.
So at the nature journals, sometimes it can be up to a month, but we would consider if it takes a month for us to tell you whether or not we sent your paper out to review, that would be a failure of our systems. We try and get back to authors within 1 week. Sometimes in busy times, it can be 2 weeks. But that's to say whether or not we are sending your paper out to review or not. And then from there, a month would be a very short turnaround time at a nature journal. First decision is usually month and a half, 2 months, sometimes 3 months. If you know that your paper's been sent out to review and you haven't got anything back after, say, 2 or 3 months, then you're totally, it's totally reasonable for you to drop a line to the editor and say, can you give me an update of progress on my paper? And increasingly, publishers, us included, are trying to build systems that means that you can find out what is the current status of your paper much more readily. Some publishers do it better than others. So my background is in physics. The American Physical Society is very good at that, have had systems since the 90s for telling you the status of your paper. I'm sad to say, nature has not always been so good at this, but we're getting better.
Yeah, I agree with Ed, and yeah, that really depends on journals. Some journals, they are editorial fast turnaround, and then they will reply very promptly. But there are cases actually because the journal maybe because of the article difficult to find the right reviewer, then may take longer time. But I think there is no harm to ask. I mean, there are always no harm to ask. That is most important. I think I just saw another question about asking for recommendations. Just email, just ask. Don't be shy. That is very important because we all work as a team. The one who contribute article, the one who process the article, the one who get the review actually is a whole team. So it's okay to ask. Don't worry about it.
Well, now here's a related question about this review process. So the participant is asking, what about publishing in journals who have a very fast review process? I think maybe it was Barry who touched on this with some of the predatory journals who promise kind of a fast turnaround. And so they want to know about journals that maybe the process is less than a month. Should the researcher be skeptical of journals promising that kind of turnaround time?
Yes. As I said, I think predatory journals have worked their way into the ecosystem because there has been this maybe slightly slower than expected response from the big publishers. So it provides a gap in the ecosystem, and they've capitalized on that. So I'd be very wary of any publisher that claims to be able to turn around papers in 48 hours, for example. That would be virtually impossible. We are all trying to reduce the time by which we process. I mean, that's certainly true. So that's why I said you've got to check the publisher, check the journal. There are resources available. And if you do that, if you do the due diligence, think, check, submit, you should be safe.
The one thing I would add to that is an observation, is that actually it should be difficult to get your paper published. And seems like an unusual thing to say. But the thing is, it's the purpose of the whole system is to improve the research that is published. Now, you can't improve it if you don't change it. The whole point of the system is to scrutinize research so that when a paper is published, it's the best paper it can be. And that's not just for the community, that's also for you. If your paper is published without any scrutiny and there is an error, or if it isn't the best paper that it can be, then either it will be an embarrassment when it's published, or it'll make no impact whatsoever. So the whole point of the process is to scrutinize your paper, is to subject it to criticism so that you can improve the paper. And if you improve the paper, you can be much more proud of the paper, and the paper will make more impact. So be very skeptical about anywhere that says we make getting your research published easy. The technical bits, that should be easy. So we should be, our systems for dealing with these things, that part should be easy. But the science itself, persuading other people of the weight of the claims that you're making, that should be a difficult thing. And if it's easy, then you should go, I think there's something wrong here. You want us to make it difficult for you to publish your research, because that will make your research better. And if if the person that you're submitting to won't do that, then I think you should question what's going on.
I think exactly that is the case. I think nowadays, why open access become the predatory at the beginning. I think you just imagine as a the subscription-based journal. Actually, we choose the best paper to publish. So published is very difficult, as what Ed said. It's not. I mean, we always choose the best. I mean, if it's, your paper is not good enough, actually we don't even want it, because you are not paying for it anyway, right? And we want people to pay to read it. So that's the reason. Don't just look at the fast turnaround. And in fact, just now I mentioned about the H factor. I mean, the H factor is your own performance as a researcher. It tells you about the first H article get H citation. So if your article never get a citation, I mean, your H factor will be affected. So and nowadays, actually finding a reviewer is not a simple task. It's actually editorial department spend a lot of times to find the right reviewer. That's why those who promise you with fast turnaround, fast review process, and within, say, days, 1-2 days, that kind of thing, I think you have to be very careful. It is a proper reviewing process actually take not much longer than
that. I believe, Barry, you mentioned one point about the article, the manuscript should not be too short or too long. I also got that question from researchers as well, because how short is short, how long is long, except some particular journal or communication that have specifically say no more than 800 words. That's very clear. But in general, what is your opinion about short or long?
Very hard to say. It very depends on the subject areas, of course, and yes, certain journals will be having a slightly different role in the ecosystem. As long as the paper is structured with the proper methods, results, conclusion, I'm not sure if the length is as important as those elements and having the data accessible, etc. So, and my own experience actually is much more in the social sciences and humanities, where, of course, there is in some cases very long articles and chapters of a book, actually. There's a bit of overlap between what is an article and what is a chapter of a book, especially in the social sciences and humanities. So I don't know if I would want to give a page length or number of words. Again, I think you've got to know the journal. As we said, you've got to choose the journal you want to publish in. get a feel for the length of articles that journal commonly publishes, and then I think that will give you your best guidance. Ed?
Yeah, I would add to that. I think page lengths or word lengths can be misleading. In the natural sciences, just as a rule of thumb, this is just a rule of thumb, about 2,000 words is probably about the right length for a paper, but then that's just the natural sciences. Actually, what you should be thinking about is not how many words, but how many ideas you're trying to describe. Most papers are read or cited 0 times. So you can get cited once or read once, or rather, actually, no, that's an unfair description. When someone reads a paper, like researchers are very busy. When they read a paper, they're trying to find what is the new information that I need to get from this paper. When most people read a paper, most papers that get read by scientists, the scientists will, or the readers will remember 0 things about those papers. So if the reader comes away with one idea, one new idea from that paper, you're doing better than average. The mistake that many people make, and it's a natural mistake because our experiments are our children, and we love all of our children, we love all our results, and we want to be able to set all of them free and describe everything that we've done. But readers don't have the time to be able to learn about everything that you've done. So I tell people when they start out writing a paper, what is the one thing that you want the reader to remember when they get to the end of your paper? What is the one thing? And that one, if someone reads your paper and they don't come away with that idea, what would you be very sad that they didn't learn from your paper? That one thing should be the theme of your paper. And so when you write it, your paper should be as long as you need in order to demonstrate the clarity, the reality, the significance of that one idea. And so what you want to avoid is putting in lots and lots of ideas and hope that some of them will stick or some of them will make an impact. Make your paper about one big new idea or one important key result. And that will help you work out how long the paper should be. And that will enable your results to have more impact.
I think another point I want to highlight is different types of paper, they have different purposes. I mean, for example, review paper supposed to be a very highly cited. That means normally for review paper, people will expect someone will have a very good literature survey, a lot of information, so that people want to start out with this field to know where to get started. So that tends to be longer. But for short communications like letters, all these, because they're fast turnaround, because something happening very fast, you want to report it immediately, those are normally a shorter. But in general, I still remember my time when I published, actually we have this called page charge. I think nowadays very few journals asking people to pay page charge. It's cost me around $100+ US a page. That's why at that time I think I tried to make my paper within 15 pages. So that is how I calculate. But nowadays they use words that is slightly different. But I think it really depends on, as what Ed mentioned. I mean, what you want to communicate. You just make it the right. Don't unnecessarily make it too long. And that's why the word I mentioned, wordy, is the one you don't necessarily make it too long. So that is the most important.
Thank you. Very clear. Very clear. You have next question?
I do. I've got many here. Here. This is a question I've been asked quite a few times. So let me just go back to it here. How can you publish data if you've been working on a project that maybe is funded by the government, or it's a commercial entity that's funding the project, and there are some privacy issues related to the data coming out of that project? So what's your advice on that for a researcher who's working in a project and the terms of that project, that funded project, kind of restrict what you can do with the data?
That's a very, very good question. The challenge that we face as a publisher is that if you are publishing results on, if you're publishing a paper on results that are hidden, then that research can't be scrutinized as well as it should usually. Now there are several different ways in which data cannot be necessarily openly communicated. The most important is when it's clinical data and contains sensitive information about patients. And this has been something that the open access, open research movement has worked a lot to try and solve. And the way that we share data when there is that sort of sensitive information is on servers where there is password control, and if someone has a legitimate reason to need access to the data to either expand on or use the data, then they can be provided with authorized access to data. So that's how we open up the data for clinical data that is sensitive. For data that is proprietary, we would generally not publish a paper for whose data can't be accessed by anyone. So that's something that we probably wouldn't do. When I worked in industry for a little bit at Philips, and the thing is, we didn't publish the papers that we thought were going to be sensitive, that are going to give our commercial people the edge, our competitors the edge. Well, the stuff that we published was stuff that we didn't care that much about. The stuff that we didn't publish was the stuff that we really cared about. So I would be questioning why it is that you're publishing a paper if you can't give away the data, if you can't release results. There are some, now, an area where this is becoming challenging is particularly in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and this uses code and very sophisticated machines that aren't publicly available. And so we're now having to grapple with, things like Google's and Facebook's and Microsoft's. We're now having to grapple with the questions like, do we publish research if people can't access the code, if people can't access the machines, if they can't reproduce the results? And increasingly we're saying we can't be publishing this sort of stuff. There needs to be some degree of access. So the one thing that I would say is that if there are restrictions on the data, on the code, or on things that you can't share, this has to be made clear in the paper at submission. So if there is sensitive data, so that's my recommendation, not to not submit it for consideration by a journal, but to explain very clearly what it is that you can share and what it is that you can't share. And I would encourage you to try and share as much. It's interesting that you say governments. Increasingly, governments around the world are keen to open up data because they see the benefit that data collected in this lab over here could be used in this lab that we're also funding over here. And so by encouraging them to share it, then that data can be made much more impactful, much more useful, more generally. So you get more return on your investment in the data. So increasingly, governments are keen to be opening up data. Again, I agree. I understand that when you're dealing with commercial entities, there can be issues, but so long as you explain it up front, you should be fine.
Yes, and your example of the Genome project was a brilliant illustration of that. The US has made a lot of money out of that. I suspect if Donald Trump had been president at the time, he might have taken a different view on the return on investment. But let's not go there.
No. And here's a question maybe from the other end of the spectrum. So there's a researcher here who's looking for repositories for clinical trial data sets. Any suggestions on that?
Well, I'm not the expert, but if you go to our data service help desk, they will be able to point you in the direction. It doesn't cost anything for that sort of advice. They will be able to point you in the direction of an appropriate repository. There are a number, and so our experts on the data support services will be able to tell you where you can best deposit that data.
Good.
Well, I have a question and want your opinion on, I have a researcher who said that publish in open access journal is costly. So she prefer archive in biological field.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your view? Do you view those kind of easy access, almost, it's actually, we don't have to pay anything, those archives as your competitor of open access or not?
Mm-hmm. I would be interested in the other people's the other panelists' opinion on this as well. We feel that so on the archive, we feel that green open access has been a really useful way of moving us towards open access, but there are issues with that in terms of the number of versions that are out there. And I think I've always been a very strong supporter of preprints because I think it's a way of ensuring the early sharing of research in a community, and it can help really release. It's important in many different instances. And so certainly preprints, but we believe that there are so many benefits to gold open access that our feeling is that that should be the way that the world should go. Now, there is the question of cost. Now, one thing I should say is that in any of our open access journals, purely open access journals, if you don't have the funds to be able to pay the article processing charge, let us know when you submit, and we will consider waiving that. If you just don't have the funds to be able to provide that APC, let us know at the point of submission. You can't ask us to waive the fee once we've agreed to publish your paper. You have to ask for this permission at the beginning, and in most cases we will allow that, because from the outset we've been very clear. What we care about is good science, not science that will make us a lot of money, particularly at Nature Communications. So and we believe that if we continue to publish good science, then our commercial success will be assured. So we want to continue to do that. And so particularly in places like Cambodia and Thailand and throughout the global South, we realize that there are scarce funds for research. But we are very keen, I am very keen, that we publish more research from the global South, because this is increasingly where solutions to the world's problems will be found. And we can't swap one barrier to research being shared, being subscription paywalls. We can't swap that for another, which is that people don't have the money to pay. And so, and increasingly we are reaching out to funders and governments to say, what can we do together to help improve the ability of research to publish their papers open access, because it makes more impact. So that's my feeling on that.
This is very interesting, and I would say that you're going to get protests from the other world who say that you give privilege to whoever you mention there. And practically, how many percentage of what you have waived this fee?
Well, the waivers are in some cases available globally. So not all researchers in the West are rich and have got lots of money for this. So I think there's we take a view, certainly Springer Nature, I'm sure World Scientific, certainly at Tone Francis, we take a view wherever the research is coming in from. But Ed's point about trying to not put up a paywall after having brought down the paywall of subscription business is a very important point. And also, there are many different models to publishing now. It's a very diverse ecosystem. So funders quite often do provide the funds, increasingly provide the funds for the processing charges. And in our case with F1000, we're talking to funders and institutions to ensure that the funding model is all taken care of up front. And therefore, the submission process is very much more straightforward. It's just based on the quality of the science, the peer review pressure, the peer review process, and it's much more quicker as a result. So the models are flexing to the global economy, the global sort of decision-making relating to funding, and it really is very diverse. Truly a global set of problems which we're tackling in a very sort of local way.
Well, that's some good news. That's definitely some good news. Another question here I've just discussed with John Seraphin. So how do you, let's just come back to this here. How can you tell which journal has Tier 1 or Q1? Do you want to elaborate?
I certainly published while I was at the University of Arizona, and I did not hear anything about this Tier 1, Tier 2, quartile 1, 2, 3, 4 until I came to Thailand, because it impacts a lot of promotion and tenure, and the fact that they can receive certain grant or not. So I just wonder if I can modify this question is, you three as a publishers, and you handle many journals in different areas, do you yourself has a list or ranking or division of which one is in Q1, Q2, and so on? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I have some sense. Different countries have different, impact factor. I think impact factor is really problematic. I think, so we, just last month, or was it the month before, we as a publisher signed the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. And that declaration encourages funders and everyone in the research ecosystem to avoid assessing research based on where it's published. Research, the significance of a piece of research should be judged on that research alone, not where it was published, a high impact factor journal or not, because impact factors are problematic because the impact factor of Nature is determined by a handful of papers. It's not determined by the bulk. It's determined by a handful of very highly cited papers. And it's unfair to judge a paper at one end of the spectrum by the impact of a paper that was published in the same journal. It doesn't actually affect the impact of that. So I think that's really problematic. And I think we need to get away from, I think it's really damaging for science to be counting papers and to be requiring that the best researchers publish in only a handful of journals. Research should be judged by the research itself. Now, not everywhere in the world is yet of the same view, but the world is changing. Australia has been very far ahead in terms of not requiring researchers to submit their papers in particular impact factor journals. America, Europe, they're all moving in the direction of judging research on its own merits and not where it was published. Other parts of the world, they're still very much focused on where a paper was published. We don't think that that's a good way to go. We think that the research should be published on its own merits. So we don't promote impact factors as a single big, this is the only thing that you should care about. Impact factors are useful for deciding whether or not a journal is worth your time, because it does give you some impression of the impact of the research that's appearing in that journal. So impact factors are good for determining the impact of a journal, but they're not good for determining the impact of individual papers within that journal.
It's a proxy, isn't it?
Yeah, I just want to share one interesting conversation I had with a very senior researcher from the Nobel Foundation. Few years ago, actually, we were doing a dinner. We want to start a new journal, and then he used to be the chair of the I think chemistry award. And then he talked about, and then I went as from a publisher, of course, then impact factor the topic will come up. You know what he said? He said, don't care about impact factor. If people ask what is the impact factor of our journal, tell them 100. As simple as that. They don't believe. I tell you in the truth. I mean, a lot of researchers, this impact factor is actually more for, in our. That's my personal opinion. Actually, it's for publisher to sell to the librarian. That is the only thing.
Yes, I was going to say, I think librarians like to look at it. Administrations,
yes,
like to look at it. And I think researchers, academics, that you yourselves, you should assess which journals are good and be much more actually subjective. There's a bit of qualitative discussion needed, not just can it be measured, therefore it's number one. Don't be obsessed by rankings, don't be obsessed by impact factors. Really, it's got to service the needs of a community, and very hard to compare the needs of one community to another community. So impact factor for one journal, completely irrelevant for social sciences and humanities.
No.
Yes, extreme. So yes, be very wary.
Okay, now we want to keep things positive, but there's another question that's come up related to predatory journals. So I gather there was a list, there used to be a list called Beale's list of predatory journals. And the comment here is that that was sort of something that people spoke a lot about a few years ago, but it seems to have gone a bit quiet. So would somebody like to address that? That list,
I think
what happened to it?
Yeah, I think it's no longer kept up. And I heard there was a list called the white list as opposed to the black list. Because I think there was a few, concerns about the errors that were creeping into Beale's list in particular. So it's there. There are other groups that are monitoring this. And I think I gave the websites of a couple of organizations that are legitimate journals to be trusted and legitimate publishers to be trusted. I would use those websites. Gentlemen, are you aware that this is being monitored actively?
Yeah, but Beale's list isn't being maintained, and there is this distinction between blacklists and whitelists, and we think blacklists are problematic. I mean, it gave Jeffrey Beale a lot of power to punish journals, and that shouldn't be how it's done. So we prefer the concept of a whitelist because we think it's more constructive, more useful. The institutions that you cited, DOAJ and IASPA, are both very good, reputable places to look for advice on where to publish, particularly the Directory of Open Access Journals. And so I think that's the best advice, is to look for whitelists of journals like that.
Yeah, my understanding of Beale list is because Beale is actually a librarian. Is the librarian create this list for the library and then share online. But I think over the years, because the criteria isn't that clear, and then some not really predatory publishers are also in the list. And that's why my understanding was, because he doesn't want to get into too much legal issue, that's why he never maintained it. It stopped at that. But the reason is I still remember this because a couple years back when I was talking about this topic, that list was still available, but now actually it's just put in the background, never maintained. I agree. We should look at the white list rather than the black list. And then just now the way that we asked you to check and all the whole list of ways that you can find out what are the right journal, what are the properly maintained legitimate journals, that is more important rather than what is bad. Yeah.
Now a related question. So assuming you as a young researcher, you're fairly confident that you're not dealing with a predatory publisher. The comment here, or the question here, is that you may get many journals around a particular topic. So how would you choose which particular journal to approach?
Asking your colleagues for advice is a really good thing to us. So some years ago, when we launched Nature Materials and Nature Physics, we launched Nature Materials first, and there was a community, the polymer electronics community, which we knew was going to be an important big thing, and indeed it has been. And we worked very hard to attract good submissions from the polymer electronics community. And there's a lot of physics in particularly back then, there's a lot of physics involved in understanding how these materials worked. And so some years later, when we launched Nature Physics, and then I moved from Nature Materials to Nature Physics, many of my authors asked me, he said, oh, so you're moving to Nature Physics, and we like dealing with you, and we'd like to continue to send papers to you. Should we send our papers to Nature Physics now instead of Nature Materials? And my advice to them was that we have done such a good job at cultivating this community at Nature Materials that everyone in that community now has a subscription to Nature Materials, and everyone in that community reads Nature Materials. Those people aren't yet reading Nature Physics, and so the best place to send your research would be Nature Materials. Even if it's mostly physics, Materials will continue to consider those papers because they are important to the material properties of these important materials. But that's what everyone's reading, so that's where you should publish. Even though we now have 2 journals, and actually then we launched Nature Nanotechnology, which also might consider some of these papers, and Nature Photonics. There are all these, we have lots of journals that might publish a particular paper in a given discipline. I was saying, what are your colleagues reading? Because you want to publish what journals they're reading, because that's how they'll see it, that's how it make an impact. So really asking your colleagues their advice as to what they're reading, that should be your first port of call for where you should be publishing.
One idea we have actually last time when I was still doing research, actually we tried to put in a preprint service like arXiv, and then to distribute your article and ask for comments. I understand some publisher even go to arXiv to look for articles to submit to the journal. So maybe if you're not clear, of course, ask your peer is the first person, the first thing you should do. If you're not sure, you put in those preprint servers to see any comments. I think that is another way to do if you're not getting much help elsewhere.
Now I want to move to the plagiarism. Most recently, I saw a paper that the editor sent back to the author and highlight all the repetition, and mostly it's about their own papers. And even the name of National Science and Technology Development Agency, it was counted. So some of them, it's good, and I'm familiar with some of these software from my students to cut and paste from online stuff and all that. But I never actually seen it from the editor in the manuscript. So I want to hear from all 3 of you, what is your policy? I think they were saying that they found the copying about 23%, and they have a detailed list of which journal, which articles, and a long list, 15% here, less than 1% there, 5%, and so on and so forth, and they sum it all up, and they say that this is above 23%, and we will accept if you have this less than 15%, if I get the number right. So I said, okay, at least they allow this 15%, because it's ridiculous in the affiliation or acknowledgement that when they talk about people and affiliation, it's all caught, I would say it that way. So what is your policy when it comes to software plagiarism like this?
Well, yes, there is a balance of respecting authoritative figures in the field, and particularly in your own institution. And of course, in Asia, that's very much part of the culture to be respective of what's gone before you. But the guideline of 15%, I haven't actually heard that before, but that's probably a reasonable guideline. We're very conscious of self-plagiarizing, plagiarizing in general. So I would say you should err on the side of caution. If there's not enough original material, then it shouldn't be submitted. 15%, gentlemen, is that a reasonable amount of material which seems to be on the edge of being self-plagiarized? Perhaps that's too strong a word.
It depends. It depends on the context. It really does depend on the context. So that number is only useful for raising a red flag. It shouldn't.
Right.
It shouldn't be used as a proxy for
No.
accepting or rejecting a submission. And yeah, about somewhere around 20% is where experience would suggest that's
Same here,
where
20%.
that's the. Yeah, somewhere around the 20% mark. Different publishers, different things. That's where a red flag goes up and says to the editor, you should take a look at this and see whether or not, just convince yourself that it is new research and hasn't been taken from elsewhere. And that's when we would look at a detailed report and look at how so obviously in affiliations, we would go, yeah, that's not plagiarism. And sometimes where you see the most innocuous plagiarism, self-plagiarism, is in the method section. And there is some debate about whether or not that should count or not. I don't have a strong feeling about that. The key is that if you're submitting a new paper, it should describe new results. It should new insights, new data, all of these things, and that should be. And so, if you're just copying the introduction and copying the conclusions, then you haven't really got anything sufficiently new. So, I would be surprised. I am surprised that a paper was declined simply by quoting a number and saying you need to get the number down. Because I've seen attempts to try and get this number down from people who were doing. You can game the system in ways that is not good.
Now I clarify this. This is actually the process before the editor sent out to the review. Editor receive it and within a week or a few days bounce back to the review to the author and say, fix this, resubmit it before we will start the reviewing process.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my opinion, it shouldn't be based on the number. It should be saying all your method section has been copied from your previous paper. If you've done different experiments, then the method section should be different. So change them. Like, what are you doing? I wouldn't. We shouldn't be going back and saying, can you just get the number down? It should be contextual. It should be about the context of what has been copied and what hasn't.
Yeah, I also feel a bit surprised if that is the reason to push it back to the author. I think it really depends on what you are talking about. What are the part that you are copying? Because actually, if I recall properly, in this authenticated system, actually there are some settings. For example, certain things shouldn't be counted, like bibliography, or if you a quotation. But if you don't know how to do quotation, people will thought that you are copying. I mean, that's why I mentioned you need to read through some of the things that the publisher use and make sure you are not falling into that trap. Like even a symbol. I mean, the quotation, if you use a single quote and they're very different from a double quote. I mean, the computer software may not know the difference. Actually, you meant the same thing, but actually they may consider as a copying. So I think if you are talking about just copying, quoting the source, in a way, I think it's also something we English as not the first language need to really learn how to digest it and then write in your own word. I think at the end of the day, you still need to learn that kind of tricks or skill. You should have that kind of skill. Yeah, but I will be surprised if that is if you just use the number 20%. Or my understanding in our case, 20% will just raise a flag. That's all. It's not stopping it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Next question.
Couple of questions. Yeah, there's lots of people asking about impact factor. Question: what is between impact factor and quartile ranking? Which is the most important in determining the quality of a journal? And how are these indices different? Who would like to tackle that?
I'm not sure what a quartile. I'm not sure what a quartile is. This is a question for funders and institutions.
Yeah.
And we think that journals shouldn't be ranked, or research shouldn't be ranked based on these sorts of things. So as publishers, we strongly advise, and Nature has written countless number of editorials telling funders and institutions, if you're measuring research by where it's published, then you're measuring it wrong.
My understanding, okay, you look at how impact factor is being calculated. It's really just a number based on certain number of citation, and that citation can be coming just from one paper. So you represent the whole journal. Actually, that doesn't make sense in that sense. But if you look at the absolute number, that also doesn't make sense. We have one journal, actually we were ranked #1 in the world by another index, but our impact factor number is very low. So it doesn't really matter. But what I said, the same thing as the quartile, from our point of view, is more for commercial purpose. It is to convince people to subscribe to our journal, to publish to our journal because of all this. And that is the main reason only.
Yes, I just add that I think we've got to be very careful about these derivatives. I mean, I look at the finance industry and the mess that they got into with playing around with derivatives. I think we should get back to what the community think is good science, and funders and administrators perhaps are being a bit guilty of overthinking this. All you got to do is ask the researchers.
Yeah, I think the challenge is maybe not with the publishers, but with the various research agencies here who are demanding this of their researchers. That you got to publish in this journal or that journal. I know this may be really a webinar into itself, but there's a question here, and maybe we could ask each of you just to touch on it very, very briefly, one or two suggestions. If you're interested in becoming a reviewer, what would be your advice?
Get in touch, please. Send us your email. We will be on you like a shot. We are, I think, all of us really keen on having more reviewers, especially from this part of the world. It's a great step in your career to become a reviewer, especially of a highly respected journal. But it'd be a great opportunity. So no, we're very happy to hear from anyone that wishes to become a reviewer. Thank you.
Yeah, I think become a reviewer, of course, you have to show people you are really expert in that particular field. I mean, how to show it, I think you have your own way of doing it. You do certain publication, and at the same time, maybe you also, like just now I mentioned PubOn, you should register, put in PubOn, because actually we are using PubOn to look for reviewers. I can imagine if you write comments for even books related to the field, probably people will look up for you as well. So there are many ways that you can make yourself known so that people will run to you. But of course, if you Barry said, I mean, if you know a particular journal well, and then you think that you're expert in that field, yeah, please come forward. Tell the editors that you have a lot of knowledge, you know what this field is all about, and then I definitely will keep you in the list.
I actually, one thing that I wanted to echo was what Rick said about the importance of ORCIDs. The one thing that how we find referees is by many different ways, and so you should be trying to increase the chances that we will find you, and we will find you in a discipline that is relevant. If you have an ORCID and you make sure that your record is populated with your publications in ORCID, it makes it much easier for editors to find you and to be confident that you are the person, you are the author of these papers, and that actually you have that expertise that Rick mentioned. And so please, everyone who's listening, register for an ORCID, make sure that your ORCID is connected to your publications.
Yep.
And when you submit your publication, submit your ORCID along with your publications so that it can be connected to the metadata. It's the most important thing. Now, in places like the US, I think it's still important, but one of the reasons why we tend to get lots of referees from the US is because they have great web pages. They're fantastic. So they're really easy to find. They're really visible because, Americans are a lot more showy and all that sort of thing. So they're more visible.
Yep.
In other parts of the world, it's more difficult. Interestingly, in France, it's very difficult to find referees because they don't tend to have these web pages that single out the researcher. In China, it's terrible because institutional websites in China are just
No,
abysmal. They're not up to date.
no.
And so the thing I've said often in China is get an ORCID, and that should be the place where you showcase your research.
Yeah.
When you showcase your research, then you're more likely to get the attention of an editor who want to use you and get your advice. One other, it's a smaller thing, but make use of author contribution statements in your paper. What's really useful to an editor is to be able to understand who did what in a paper. We find referees often from the literature. We'll look at the key literature and we'll see a paper that's relevant to this submission, and then we'll go look at that paper and we'll go, oh, who were the authors on this paper? If in addition to being an author on that paper, at the end it says, I'm an expert in this aspect of the paper, if that's the sort of referee that we're looking for, then we will go to you. And so making sure that you explain what it is that you did on a paper in the author contribution statement is another way that you can make sure that your contribution is conspicuous and obvious to everyone. And if that's the case, then they're more likely to ask you for your opinion on research in a relevant area.
Yep. Agree.
All right. I think I will have one last question here before I hand it to Simon. It's about authorship dispute. Now, in my career, I never have that. So, and I am glad that I didn't have to deal with any of this. But you, as the publisher or editor, I believe you have a lot of fun story to tell us. But specifically, we want to know what your approach or how you handle if there is authorship dispute or when they quarrel or disagree or something like that. Share with us some of those, please.
Who wants to go first?
I don't know. I don't have an author's. I don't have that kind of story, but lately I have to handle one very strange situation. Actually, is related to plagiarism. Okay, this is a paper. Actually, the author is from Romania, and then his paper was published. But later on, someone complained to a court in Romania, say that they have another division talking about your plagiarism. So we take it down, but then he go back to another court in Romania, said that no, this is not the case. So we are being stuck in the middle. So what we did was actually we still put up a note on our website. We took down the article, but we put a note on the website. We said that we wait for the court final decision. One of the trouble is the court hasn't, because of the COVID, hasn't come back to the final decision. Then the author is complaining. And the other problem is because all the legal document is in Romanian language that we understand nothing about it. So we said that at the end of the day, I just have to wait for the court resume. I think probably in August, then we'll see what's the final decision. That's the one case that I'm handling now, so I can think of.
So our approach to authorship disputes is that it's very difficult for us to make a decision in these sorts of disputes. We have guidelines for who should be an author and shouldn't be. Well, we refer to COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, their guidelines for who should be authors. We've recently passed a policy that encourages, and we'll be putting on this up on the webpage soon, that encourages the greater inclusion of researchers from the Global South. One that is of a concern to us is when researchers from wealthy countries then parachute into a country and they do some research and then they leave and they get and they're the only people who contribute to the intellectual content of the paper. And we think that's not a good way of doing science. If you're doing research in a country, it will improve the science if you have local collaborators. And we would like to see more collaborations between the wealthy North and the Global South in terms of research, particularly in the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because unless we involve everyone who is affected by these issues, we're not going to find the solutions to these. So we are strengthening our recommendations in terms of the inclusion of authors who have something to do with the paper. So we're encouraging these collaborations and recognition of these collaborations. Who should be an author? Again, we would refer to the COPE guidelines. When there is a dispute, you can get in touch with the journal, but then our journals will then reach out to the institutions and then ask the institutions to deal with these disputes. And then we will reflect whatever is the conclusions in a paper. But we think the institutions are better placed to be able to get to the bottom of these disputes than we are. It's very difficult for us. We don't have much. We don't have the resources, but also we're not close to the researchers, so it's difficult for us to find out the facts of a case. So we usually get in touch with institutions and ask them to try and unpick the problem.
Yeah, I just add that it's so important. You mentioned diversity and inclusivity. That is a bit of a well-worn phrase at the moment around the world, but it's so important. We're all trying to encourage a lot more diversity in the voices contributing to science, social science, humanities research. We're very, very sincere about this. And I think through doing that, there will be a more democratic process where fairness is brought into the system. COPE, absolutely. There's an organization that looks at these ethical questions. And my colleague, Victoria Babbitt, who's joined the call from Stockholm, actually, was just sending a text message to highlight the fact that, certainly we've got these policies and maybe some guidelines on our resource website, our author support website. So please do check the websites of publishers for guidelines that might help you navigate some of these issues. But yeah, it's a very good question.
There's a specific question here for Springer Nature, which is explaining the policy of transfer manuscript. I'm wondering if maybe that could be answered in the chat box, or is there a short answer that you have, Ed, on that? The researcher says that they never obtained this offer from Elsevier, but they've twice been given this offer, I guess, from 2 submitted papers to Springer Nature. Yeah,
I'm surprised that they haven't had a similar thing from Elsevier. So we are keen. We'll be a success. Our goal is to find a home for all good scholarship. And we have enough journals, a broad enough a scope of journals, that we think that any research that is well carried out and that addresses an important problem, we should have a home for that somewhere in our journals. And so we have for a long time been developing systems to enable us to identify quickly, sometimes using machine learning to identify where a paper might be more appropriate. And so we've got this thing called the transfer desk, which is to try and ensure that a paper isn't just rejected out into the ether. If the reason for rejecting a paper has been that it's just not the right scope, I'm sure we can find another journal that has the same scope. We are still in quite the early days of rolling this out. So this is something that we are very keen to offer as a service to authors, so that you shouldn't have to keep time and time again trying to find a new journal if your paper is rejected, like I said, for reasons of scope. I'm pretty sure Elsevier is doing this as well. I know Wiley is definitely doing it. A lot of publishers are doing this. And the idea of the transfer cascade to make sure that we don't lose great research for reasons other than it being great research.
Thank you, Ed. I'm not sure if this is the right question to end on because it's a big question, but maybe this will lead us to a separate webinar down the road. But there's a number of questions here from people about open access. How does one get started? There are obviously a lot of changes in the field. It's an emerging field, et cetera. I just read a couple of days ago that the European Research Council, which is funded by the European Commission, has now decided not to follow the Plan S, which in fact was promoted by the European Commission. So you sort of got this divergence happening and so on. So anyway, just a couple of, if you could provide a couple of quick suggestions for a young researcher curious about open access, what are the sort of first steps they might take to learn more about the field and to help them in selecting their journal?
Well, Barry provided a very good suggestion of check what are the open access policies of journals that you're interested in publishing, particularly in the context of, and Rick mentioned the archive. All our journals allow you to send a preprint before submission to any of the preprint archives, bioarchive, medRxiv, archive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for almost the entirety of my career, I have been encouraging researchers to use these surfaces. Of course, once it's been through peer review and all these things, that different journals have different embargoes about that. So in the first instance, submit your research to a preprint before or at the same time as you submit to a journal. That's a good way of helping to improve the visibility of your research. As I said, if you don't have the funds to pay for the article processing charge, most journals will have a waiver policy, and in most instances, you can ask for the APC to be waived, but that has to happen at the point of first submission, not at the end of the process. Things like that. But I think preprints are the simple way to start out in this, and to use a prepreserve that other people use, like the archive, medRxiv, bioarchive. And I would just say that this is the future. Even so, I think the European Commission has been impatient, I guess, in the way that they have pushed this. But to be fair, that impatience is borne out of the fact that it's been taking us decades to try and get our act together on this. So they have reason to be impatient, but then I think that they put their foot too fast on the accelerator. I think some acceleration was certainly deserved, and they've done it across the board. And so this is challenging, particularly for the humanities, the geosciences. A lot of open access isn't as mature in many of these disciplines as it is in other disciplines. And taking a one-size approach, I think, has been really problematic for many people. And I think it hasn't done, it has forced publishers to focus on the need to open up research, and that's been a good thing. But that's been at the expense of causing a lot of confusion and a lot of, I think it could have been done better, but I understand they're impatient, because I too am impatient, because I think that science should be as open as possible. So I understand where they're coming from. This is the way that the industry will transform. It will be in missteps and stumbles and moving forward slowly but surely.
Yes, exactly. It's a bit like a dance, isn't it? It's sort of slow, quick, slow, quick, slow, quick, slow. And I think some of the mandates, some of the pronouncements, especially from Europe, have been a bit ideological in trying to pursue something which the ecosystem is just not ready to adapt, whether it be publishers or individual funding bodies, institutions, and communities of researchers. So yeah, European Commission, in fact, we've got an agreement to create an open access or open research platform for the European Commission. So we're working very closely with them, with colleagues in the UK, to do that and to help speed up this process, and hopefully provide some clarity around this in a more measured way. Yeah. Rick, do you have any final comments?
Let me yeah. I think if on open access, actually, I think that the key point is you have a good paper, okay? You have good result. You want to publish, and then finding the journal, whether open access or no open access, actually it should be the next thing that you should think of. At the beginning, whatever it is your content, what you want to tell the people, what are the good research output that you have, and if paying for APC is an issue, I tell you, all the journals that I know of, I'm sure Ed and Barry agree with me, always have a way out. always have a waiver, always, and I think Thailand is one of the country in the EIFL, EIFL, I think, what is that, EIFL, right? I mean, they always, we are working with them now, we are thinking of working with them. And then I'm sure a lot of discount or what it will come into the picture. So I don't think we should worry too much about the APC if you have a good content to share with the whole community. So I don't think that is something you need to worry too much at the beginning. Yeah.
Well, that's a very positive note to end on. I think we've got to wrap things up here, but I'll pass it to Ajanta to.
Thank you very much, you three presenters. It's very informative and give certainly researcher and those who upcoming in their research career and our faculty a different perspective from, it's very important to hear from publishers. And I think we have a very good afternoon, good session here. I hope we will follow up. And for those who have questions, feel free to send either directly to the presenter or to us at NSTDA here, and we will make sure that you get some response. And last is for the audience, could you please fill in the feedback form and get in touch with us to let us know what else you want to hear from us and what else that you think might be useful for your career. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
See you again soon, we hope.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.